Welcome to Writer, featuring writers in conversation on current hot topics. I'd like to introduce Anniqua Rana and Deb Brandon, who are going to be discussing textiles, weaving, and culture. Deb Brandon is the author of the award-winning book Threads Around the World, From Arabian Weaving to Batik in Zimbabwe. Her passion for traditional textiles emerged during her evolution as a weaver. Dr. Anniqua Rana is the author of Wild Boar in the Cane Field. She grew up in Pakistan, where she would spend summer vacations embroidering, crocheting, and knitting. She's a passionate advocate for the rural women of Pakistan, who spend much of their time harvesting cotton to create thread for a wide variety of products. Welcome, Anniqua and Deb.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you. Looking forward to our discussion today.
So I have a question for you. So growing up knitting and crocheting and all that, did that come from your mother, or was it from the community, or what?
Well, so my own personal background is interesting because my mother's from England, and she was taught by nuns when she was still in elementary school how to embroider and sew. So she brought some of the finesse with her, but culturally there is an expectation, or there was particularly for young women in particular, as is typical in any patriarchal society, that the women in particular would be doing, know a variety of different ways of embroidery or sewing and knitting. And it was, for the most part, because of a lot of festivities require a lot of clothes and outfits, like we were talking about just earlier. So the concept of ready-made was not around during our time. You would either go to a seamstress or a tailor and have your outfit sewn, or you would sew them yourself. And then the same thing with the embellishments. You would have people who actually did this as craftsmen, and they were actually, this is interesting because they were primarily craftsmen who did the more unique embellishments, but women would also embroider and do patchwork and all kinds of embellishments, whether it was for clothes that you would wear or linens that you use around the house. But you had mentioned, Deb, that you were also introduced to, the concept of fabrics, and in a very organic way, as we discussed. Tell me a bit about your experience in Israel and otherwise.
Well, my mother's English.
Oh.
She taught me to knit when I think the time it took was when I was 7. I think she had I forget what method she used, but I had to adapt it to myself, so it took a little bit. But after that, things sort of evolved from there. In school, I learned to sew and embroider. So in school, we still had arts and crafts stuff, and we had a really good teacher who was interested in textile techniques. So I learned to weave there. We spent a year, so as you said, I grew up in Israel. So when I was 6, we moved to Israel. When I was 12, we spent a year in England, and while I was there, I learned machine sewing and made my own clothes. And my mother was not the one to do the machine sewing. My father did all that, the bedspreads, the curtains. Well, once I learned to sew, it was my job to do that. And it was my job to patch my brother's pants. But I stopped, I put a stop to that by patching them with flowery patches because I figured they wouldn't like that. So I was always interested in making. But then growing up in Israel, there was this exposure to textile techniques, well, not just the traditional crafts. So, at home, there were pillow covers, wall hangings, rugs, various other things. And my parents loved the handmade stuff. So that love really somehow, by osmosis, happened to me as well. And I continued to learning more and more techniques as I grew up. I continued knitting. A friend taught me to crochet. I was going to take weaving classes, but broke my hand, so couldn't go to that. So instead, I learned to spin yarn, and then the following, when my hand was okay, I learned to weave. So weaving was my favorite. I mean, I love making, period, but weaving was my favorite. I sort of felt like I'd grown into myself, as though I'd been a weaver in a previous life. I mean, I sat at the loom, and I also felt connected to other weavers around the world and across time, across space and time. So yeah, that's,
you mentioned
yeah,
that about weaving, the concept, the symbol of a spinning wheel, or it's a very mystical symbol as well. And there's that intrinsic connection with the human soul, the human spirit, with this concept of spinning thread and then weaving it. Which I had forgotten after I had moved to the US, this concept of the calm and the peace that you get out of creating.
Yeah.
And I still had this joy of being around fabric, and particularly trying to distinguish between naturally made fabric versus synthetic fabrics, and trying to recognize the difference. At one point, I thought maybe it was a shallowness to it. And it was funny how, you go through this learning process of your connection with materials. And now, as I'm getting older, I have 3 sisters, and they are also, very good at knitting and crocheting. And one sister knits regularly for babies that have not yet even been born. I think that's a pastime. But I have also found, even though my finished product is not necessarily a product that, that is that unique, but just the process of connecting with yarn and creating something out of it. One of the stories that one of my sisters mentioned was about a gatekeeper in one of our homes in Pakistan, who had been a veteran from the Second World War, and he would knit his own sweaters. He would recycle yarn to knit sweaters, and he had created his own knitting needles to do this. And again, being, as I said earlier, in a place like Pakistan, it was unique to see particularly men knitting. And I feel that there is this calmness that comes with this kind of activity, which unfortunately, actually, I've seen an uptrend, an awareness of this, more interest in yarns and knitting and weaving, which I think is positive about the way things are going. But yeah.
Well, I think without it, unfortunately, I think, well, and this is true of the arts in general, I think without that, we lose something of ourselves. And I think it's really important to keep that. And that in particular, the textile arts are fundamental to our being. I mean, I usually wear clothes when I'm outside, right? Most people are the same way. And from when people started wearing clothes, it's something we all do. And so that's one part of it. So it connects us to the past, but also with textiles, their stories are intrinsic. I'm intrinsic in textiles. It's really curious. I mean, if you think about it, everything we wear has a story to it. I mean, it's funny because I know some people who work towards the final product and those who focus more on the making. I mean, I make stuff, and once it's done, it's okay, who can I give this to? I mean, I do have some of my own things, but most of them I've given away. I just don't keep them because I've put something of myself into it, and when I give it away, I'm giving something of myself. So there's a whole part of making that's I don't know, it's very personal, and I think it creates connections among us. And yes, for instance, we're talking about traditional textiles. Yes, they celebrate our differences, but through the stories, they become universal. I mean, people relate to them, and we relate to each other.
It's like when you get the opportunity to see a fabric that was created hundreds of years ago, and you look at the embellishment on it. And if you have gone through this process of embroidery or knitting, or, you know, any way of creating something, you look at this and you imagine that human being that spent hours planning, you know, what the design would look like, which colors to use, and, you know, what order, what sequence to put whatever embellishment you're putting on it, or when you're weaving it. I would imagine. I've never really woven anything per se. I mean, I've done knitting and crochet. What I found really interesting is, as part of the attire, the shalwar kameez that we were mentioning earlier, the baggy pants that's worn in a lot of South Asian countries, the cord to keep the shalwar up, that is also woven. And what I have found so fascinating, particularly for special events like weddings and so on, but even otherwise, when you're gifting someone, that cord is woven with intricate designs and with tassels and with, and you think about all of the thought that goes into making just the cord for those pants, that is probably not going to be seen apart from by a few people.
Right.
But there's just this, you know, the planning behind it and the thought behind it. It's a very productive way, a very calming way,
Yes.
to, you know, to use your time,
Right.
and use it in a very creative way. Similarly, hair extenders, again, the operandas, they're made the same way. They were made with threads, and then that actually, my sisters and I would make that around the 70s and 80s. There was this trend that returned of having a hair extender that coordinated with the clothes that you're wearing. And again, it was something that was embellished with tinsel and all kinds of shiny objects, or and there was the pleasure of making them and then moving them into your hair. I feel, I mean, you do feel a bit of nostalgia for things like that, but I think there's some basic benefit to us as individuals. It's like the trend of going back to cooking from scratch. I think also and I would hate to think that it's just a trend, but the interest in understanding how the garments that you're wearing or using, I mean, you talk about pillow covers being embroidered. That was, there was an expectation of a dowry, but summers, long summers would be spent embroidering bed covers and bed sheets and, you know, things that you would then use with crochet, hand crocheted edges to them. That really add a beauty to your life, and a peace and a connection with people who have made it. Of all the crafts that you know, which of all of them do you feel you can showcase the greatest level of creativity on a personal level? I personally, I find knitting very calming, but my end product of my knitted garment is not necessarily, you know, something that I would.
Yeah. I think weaving, because I don't know, there's a piece I wove. This is when I was recovering from my brain surgery. There was a piece I wove for, there's a weaving conference, I think it's every 3 years, called Convergence. And to prove to myself that I was healing, this was I made this yardage. And just to give you an idea, and this is something I couldn't have done before the brain surgery. I mean, I became more creative, more interested in subtleties. So I wanted something to make yardage that is to do with the reflection of sunset on the water. So the warp, which is the lengthwise stuff, I did it in repeat. I dyed it in repeats of oranges, blues, whites, that kind of thing. Now the weft I dyed in a way that it ended up from the yardage had waves of blues and whites going on down it. So the warp gave me the colors with the sunset, and the weft gave me the waves on the water. I used shimmering silk to get the reflection thing going on. I used the patterning I did it's called a twill, which it's like jeans are made in a twill, sort of on these slant things. So I made it with different twills going this way and that way in combinations. And then I also added texture with sewing thread on top of it. And would I have done that with knitting? I don't think so. So I don't know.
Flexibility to your creativity.
Yes, and it's hard to explain, but as you can see, it's deeply personal. It's something that you can put so much into it. And I don't know, just watching it being created.
Did you plan all of this before you started? Did you plan all the materials out and say, this is how I'm going to use it? Or was it something that you felt that, you wanted to, as you were creating it, you needed to include some other material or some other dynamic in there?
I did plan. But for instance, the differences in the twills happened as I went. I changed as I felt like it, and then the additional texture of the wavy like texture done with the sewing thread again, that evolved as I was weaving. The amazing thing about it is watching your weaving progress into the virgin warp. So as you're weaving, you're throwing the chattel to and fro, and you see the virgin warp happening, and then the colors are interacting. So that's something that's happening as you're doing it. Interesting thing, in Moroccan weaving, among the Berber, they regard weaving as a metaphor for life, as in the life cycle of a weaver's son. Again, it's a patriarchal society, so once the son reaches adulthood or whatnot, he's gone. So setting up the frame is giving birth. Preparing the loom and all that is going through childhood, and then as you start weaving, the son is now in adulthood, going through his journey as an adult. And when the weaving ends, when you cut the thing off the loom, the textile dies. Now I'm just going, what? I am not surrounded by dead textiles. I'm sorry. Because in my mind, when I'm weaving, I'm creating something, and when I cut it off the loom, I'm freeing it into the world, I'm releasing it, and in some sense giving birth to it. So it's kind of interesting, the difference in it. But then I have a friend who goes back and forth to Morocco, and I said, okay, you need to ask them. And basically, so they actually perform the Muslim last rites to the textile as they would to a dead son. But like a dead person, the textile goes into an afterlife, into the home where it's intended to be, and it starts a new life, new stories, that kind of thing. So the whole idea of the process itself, and it makes a lot of sense, is a story, a developing story. Every time something wrong happens, like you break a warp thread, or you run into difficulties with, you finish, you don't have all the yarn you need, so you have to go get some new stuff, or there's a delay.
Kind of like the mistakes your son will make throughout his life.
Exactly. So this whole idea of the process itself, And I don't think that's the standard thing with a lot of traditional textiles. I don't think, I mean, in the patterns there's stories, in the traditions there's stories, but in the actual making, it's a process that you're making it. There's not necessarily a story that goes into the actual making, so I was really fascinated by that. And I think it as I said, I mean, stories are imbued in textiles, and that is the ultimate,
yes,
yes, this kind of thing.
Definitely. I have not heard that. I'm familiar with, my sister lives in an area, southern Punjab, which is a desert area, and it's known for all the handicrafts, particularly the embellishments with pieces of, what's it called? Gota, which is a braid, a shiny braid, and usually wedding outfits are decorated with that. And then you have springs, which are used. And so each of these embellishments has a different name and different quality to it. And some of it is sold by the weight of the embellishment in the material. So when they charge for the embroidered outfits, it's kind of what is the weight of the embellishment, and that is how much they will charge for how long. They won't consider the length of time. But another really interesting art piece is it's with recycled materials. It's very common that they're making bedspreads and quilts with patchwork, and they're not like, and this is interesting, the American patchwork, and I don't know what the foundation of the American quilting style is, but in Pakistan there isn't that much of a design element to it. It's just combining all these brightly colored shiny materials to create a comforter cover or a smaller quilt to use at a different time of the year. And I just find it interesting how some quilting techniques, I wonder what made those quilting techniques what they are, and as opposed to other techniques. And I don't know if quilting has been part of your repertoire as far as...
Well, I don't actually quilt. That's one of the things that I don't do. I don't know. I've never been...
Yes.
I try so many different things, and it doesn't happen to be one of them. But when you think about, for instance, in Japan, there's the sashiko, which is beautiful quilting done with patchworks, usually of different pieces, old pieces of indigo, where, like amongst a farmer, there's worn out stuff and they patch it up. I mean, if you go, in Japan, they actually sell them as, they're very, very expensive because they're heirlooms or whatnot. But so they end up making, for instance, a jacket out of it, or they make a quilt out of it with different styles of stitching that in itself produce a pattern. Like, for instance, just little crosses, tiny little crosses, or parallel basting stitch, running stitch, and kanta quilts is another one where the pattern comes in with the stitching more than anything else. Yes, people talk about kanta embroidery, but the kanta quilts, they have the embroidery, but the base of the whole thing is the stitching that forms the quilting. So there's all these things now in terms of, well, the American quilting, people think that they came from the Amish, but actually came from what they refer to as the English, came from Europe, from Wales, that kind of thing. But originally it was all about recycling, using bits and pieces from other things.
And I think we would have the pleasure of seeing a quilt. You think, oh, I remember that outfit. I remember somebody wore it on that wedding. And you would recognize these pieces of material from 10, 15 years ago.
I
So,
saw recently that I don't know who does it, but there's some company that you send them T-shirts that, old T-shirt that have some meaning for you,
mhm.
and they cut out the the pattern, whatever it is, the writing on it, and they piece them together,
Mhm.
and they send it back to you as a blanket or something like that. And I was going, yep, that's quilting.
And the sad
Patchwork,
Yeah,
that's
the sad thing
exactly.
is so much waste with fabric, especially with the fashion industry, is, wasted and, hurtful to the environment, where this kind of recycling could, you could probably make up for any materials that others might need,
Well,
something.
I think textiles in general especially traditional textiles, have a lot to do with sustainability in terms of the environment, which is, as you said, you've got all these clothes that, we send all these T-shirts to Africa, and no one, there's
Yeah,
only so
it's
many
not the kind
so
of
many people to wear them. I mean, they get thrown out. And so there's that side of it. There's also the side of going back to natural dyes rather than the synthetic dyes that produce all this awful pollution. So there's a lot in traditional textiles that bring out issues of sustainability, but also in different. Well, there's also this other side that was one of my pet things, which is sustainability of traditions, sustainability for helping for people trying to earn a living. I mean, that's another big problem, is that if you're trying to earn a living as a textile artist, it's tough. I mean, go to Walmart. I mean, I've done shows with my, I've sold my stuff, and lo and behold, every time I do that, there's going to be someone who says, I've seen something nicer in Walmart, and it's much cheaper. And I'm going, okay, fine. If that's what you think.
Yes, there's no answer to that argument, is there?
So, yeah, so there's so much in textiles that is there that people don't know, and I think you're really missing out. And I think educating people about these things is really important, about issues with sustainability, about the connections among us, about the beauty and the process.
So dyeing has always been integral to the way we have done things in Pakistan when I was growing up. For example, we would, when we had sweaters, you would, after a few years of using it, if the wearer, had outgrown the sweater, we would unravel it, then dye the wool a slightly different color, just so that it would freshen up a bit, and then knit it into a sweater for someone else. Similarly, bed sheets, if the color was kind of dying out, and I had an aunt who would love dyeing all the bed sheets, and they would all be dyed a certain color. And so dyeing was and still continues to be, because of the way we coordinate all of the different pieces of your your outfit. Dyeing is an integral part of fabrics on a personal, individual level. And but one style that really has picked up more recently, but is very intrinsic to the traditional Southern Punjab style, is the tie and dye, but it's done with seeds. And so you have these really bright colors, and it's called chunri, and chunri means veil. And it was really done primarily for, the veils, the dupattas that you would wear. But now it's done with saris and, the whole outfit, where you tie, it's this small little circles, but dramatic colors. And then within that, you might have some more embellishment to make those colors stand out even more. And it's a style which is unique to Southern Punjab and is known around Pakistan, and I think around the world. If you see it, it would stand out as a style that's unique. And And there are others as well, similar to that. In Sindh, there's a style called Ajrak, which is a blue dye. And I don't know the background of why it is particularly a blue dye. I don't know if it's similar to, I think there's a place in India where a certain dye color, what color is that? The teal color is used often. But that is also a fascinating part of the fabric process, is the colors and the style of dyeing. And I was wondering, Deb, if you wanted to talk a bit about batiks and your interest and knowledge about styles in dyeing, particularly in batiks.
Well, you mentioned Ajrak, and that's you said there's blue, but they also do red.
Yes, yes.
It's mostly blue and red are as the traditional colors,
Yeah.
and again, that's from the natural the colors that they get from local flora or fauna or whatnot, so a lot of the colors, for instance, depend on where you are located. So, for instance, a lot of, dyers I know around India, there are places where, because of drought, they've had to move to a different place. When situations like drought come up, you might see a community of dyers move to a place where there's more, where there is no drought or that kind of thing. There are influences from outside, like, for instance, along the Silk Road, materials, silk, well, in particular silk, came from China and ended up all over. So, for instance, if you go to Uzbekistan, the silk that they use there for their ikat, for their dyeing traditions, wouldn't have happened without the Silk Road. A fascinating one is indigo. Indigo is all over the world, all over the place. I mean, from different places in Africa, and it's been going on for, centuries in lots of places. From Africa to, the Americas, all over the place. And it seems like they were developed separately. Well, for instance, in England, there's the woad, which is, again, a form of indigo. So a lot of these things travel. The big question is where they're coming from, but it has to do with weather. It has to do with the geographic location, this kind of thing. It's in terms of why certain places do certain things. I mean, where did batik come from? Well, this is another interesting one. So there's the batik that's made with hot wax. That's the well-known one. But then in Zimbabwe, they don't use hot wax. They use sadza, which is a cornmeal paste. And that's part of their staple diet. So I guess people are very inventive in what they use as about the styles. I don't know. It's in Laos, a lot of the patterns are to do with the serpent, which is the naga, which is the I guess you could think of it as a higher being type thing to do with primordial times, with creation myths and that kind of thing. So there have been concentrations of different things depending on traditions, depending on, as I said, location. But then it takes a life of its own. I mean, you start with for instance, like with the Naga creation myths. Well, in Peru, they also have the serpent thing. This is the Shipibo people. They use cross stitch, and also they do fabric. They paint on fabric. things that look like mazes, and in fact it's to do with the serpent again. So where is this coming from? A lot of these things are coming from all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
And are they separate? Where did they originate? I don't know. I mean, there's something with mythology that there are a lot of commonalities there. So this is part of what I mean, is that there's, on the one hand, textile traditions celebrate our differences, but there are a lot of commonalities there. And in terms of, I once wrote a piece called Why in India? And why India, what I meant was, why is there such a huge variety of textile techniques there that there isn't such a variety in so many other places? Why India? And it's to do with the geographic location. It's to do with the people invading, with invaders and the wars.
Cultures, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Being along the Silk Road, the influences from Europe, all this kind of stuff. It's amazing how it works. I mean,
the one of the things I think that really stands out for a place like India is that you get the whole, from the basic, the cotton growth, you get all the basic materials, as well as the artisanship, as well as, all of the mixes of the cultures. I think being a place where the story that I have written about is based in the Punjab, where cotton is a major, cash crop. And so whether it's cotton or silk or all of these materials, it really then becomes, if you get all of the basics that you need to be able to create fabric, that in itself, leads to creating the basics. And then with the mix of all the people from different places, then you get all the styles and the different ways of either weaving the cloth or making the designs. And then, of course, with all these mixes of people, you also get the mix of the kinds of fabrics or the fashions that are created out of this. So whether it's the sari or the shalwar kameez or the, all the different groups of people who have come through the region, taking from all of them and creating, all of this variety. I think, and as you were talking about this, I was thinking, so what, if anyone was watching this, what are we trying to promote, in the sense of what do we feel strongly about? I mean, I really do feel strongly that individually the benefit of engaging with creation through fabrics, whether it's, a handicraft, whether it's making your own, items that you want to use or wear, there's that self-fulfillment feeling of calmness that you get. That's one thing, definitely. But on a larger scale, what you were pointing out was kind of an awareness of the beauty of handmade original products, and how unique they are to something that, as you say, you might get at Walmart, yes, at half the price, yes, but there's a difference, a big difference in the value of the handmade product and the thought and the human elements that go into it, as opposed to the machine-made elements. So, those are, from my perspective, what I'm thinking as a discussion. I would take away from this that personally, as well as from the community perspective, what are our takeaways?
I think it's really important to educate ourselves about how to make things, how to be a textile maker or any kind of maker, from the point of view of what it gives us. It gives us a feeling of fulfillment. The actual making itself, maybe at first when you're learning, isn't calming exactly, but once you learn the technique, it does become, it's a fabulous way of relaxing. I mean, when I sit and spin, use my spinning wheel to spin yarn, I just sit there and it's this repetitive thing, and there's something in it. It's like meditating. And you're producing something and you come away with, yes, I can write a computer program and end up with a program that does what I want it to do, but it's nothing tangible. This gives you something tangible. And I think as people, as human beings, we need the tangible. And I think we get farther and farther away from the tangible. And I really think it's important to have that have that as part of our lives. And also, in terms of when we talk about the makers, as makers, we're a community. And if you're a maker, if you become a maker, you become part of our community. I wrote my book, Threads Around the World, from Arabian weaving to batik in Zimbabwe, in order to share these stories. It's about traditional textiles from communities around the world. And there is a bit about the techniques themselves. For instance, with mirror embroidery, how you incorporate the mirror pieces into the embroidery, where the mirror pieces come from, where did they originally come from. But then there's more about the story of the people of a particular tribe in India who make these, who produce a lot of beautiful mirror embroidery. So a lot of the narrative is story-like and helps you understand the people involved, the communities, the traditions. Making in general, and in particular textile techniques, are a great way to formulate our story, individuals, as communities, as society.
So Deb has been talking about sharing threads, like people share bread. And I think that concept of community building is important. And I feel for myself, as someone who knows a bit about fabrics and so on, but I have never woven anything. And so what I would probably take away from what Deb has been sharing from us, which I think our viewers might be interested in as well, is, how to connect, on what level to connect with this whole fabric making concept, to be able to not only find peace with yourself, but also to build community. And maybe start with something like, even reading Deb's book and understanding the nuances of the materials or the cultures that she has written about, but then maybe taking it a bit further and maybe joining a group of people of weavers, or even starting with the basics of creating thread and seeing the beauty of that creation of that basic piece of, which is a very important part of humanity, of creating fabrics that are part of, that have been part of humanity from the beginning of time. So maybe taking a few classes on how to weave, or even how to create thread using a spinning wheel, or any other way to connect.
Something draws you, go for it. Just do it. You look at something. I mean, why I learned to weave is I've been seeing looms and through my life, and then I went, one of these days I'm going to do it. And finally I just said, no, I'm just going to do it. Mm-hmm. So if you see something, for instance, I knit something, and somebody will say, oh, can you make me one? Mm-hmm. Well, no, I'll teach you how to do it.
Yes.
So just do it.
Hooks are very inexpensive. $2 for a crochet hook, and a ball of yarn, probably not more than $10 if you're getting the highest quality. So you can start with something inexpensive. And there are a lot of videos on YouTube that you can watch on how to crochet. So even if you started with something like that, similarly knitting, and that once you have those implements, those tools, you can use them again and again, and they're so inexpensive.
Beading is another one that people don't think of as a textile technique, but it is. It's used to embellish things, but learning to make jewelry. All these things, there are community centers. There are people you know who probably make things and you have no idea that they're doing that. Communicate, talk to people, find out, see what they know. You know, chances are you'll find someone who might be doing something that will catch your fancy.
So Deb, this has been a real pleasure. Such a pleasant way to spend the evening talking about threads and fabrics and history and culture around it. I hope we get a chance to talk about this, and I will definitely seek you out after I have read your book. Thank you so much.
Same here. I've really enjoyed this.
So goodbye to our viewers. I hope you take away all the great information that we've just shared.
I hope you enjoyed it as much as Anniqua and I enjoyed it, and make something.